They've recovered, except for a few minor kinks.
Has he asked for anything special?
Yes, this morning for breakfast. He requested something called wheat germ, organic honey, and tiger's milk.
Oh, yes, those are the charm substances that some years ago were felt to contain life-preserving properties.
You mean there was no deep fat? No steak or cream pies or hot fudge?
Those were thought to be unhealthy. Precisely the opposite of what we now know to be true.
Incredible. Well, he wants to know where he is and what's going on.
I think it's time to tell him.
In the film Sleeper, Woody Allen plays the owner of a health food store who is cryogenically frozen in 1973 and defrosted 200 years later to find, of course, a completely different world. The film is, in some ways, a parody of real life. In 1961, the American physiologist Ancel Keys was depicted on the cover of Time magazine. Ancel Keys was largely responsible for the adoption of the idea that dietary fat causes heart disease. In 1984, Time magazine led with an article informing us about the dangers of cholesterol. Then, in a complete reversal, the June 2014 edition of Time led with a cover story encouraging us to eat butter and explaining how fat was falsely labelled as the enemy. Problems associated with the heart and blood vessels are responsible for 30% of all deaths worldwide. For the last 60 years, our health authorities have believed that dietary saturated fat and cholesterol play a causal role in these deaths.
Yeah, I mean, I think the lipid heart hypothesis, Ancel Keys' original hypothesis from the 50s, still stands up. And in many respects, the advent of the statins, highly effective drugs at lowering cholesterol, particularly LDL cholesterol, demonstrate beneficial effects. That fulfills quite a lot of causal requirements. You've got a risk factor, it's consistent, you see it in different places at different times, and when you experimentally lower that risk factor, you see the effect you predict.
However, over the years, numerous contradictions to this belief system have emerged and have been almost completely ignored. One such contradiction has become known as the French paradox.
The paradox has begun to intrigue foreign researchers. Among them, Dr. Kurt Ellison, a cardiologist and professor at the School of Public Health at Boston University.
In this restaurant where we're having lunch, this is something you just wouldn't find in an American restaurant. A Lyonnaise salad bowl, which is pig's head pate with parsley, black pudding, which is very fat, and potatoes in oil. Double fat sliced tripe sauteed with onions, and hot sausage with lentils and potatoes and oil. This is routine stuff.
There's something about the French that seems to be protecting them, and we're not sure what it is. We're looking for it.
The French paradox also prompted Dr. Malcolm Kendrick to investigate the causes of heart disease in more detail.
I started looking at the figures, and I realized that, well, if you looked at the standard figures, the French had very much the same cholesterol levels. They ate more saturated fat. When you looked at exercise, it was about the same. Body weight, blood pressure, good cholesterol. You took all the conventional risk factors, and the French probably should have a slightly higher rate of heart disease, and yet it was vastly lower. So I thought, there's definitely something not right here. This is not working. I mean, the figures just didn't work.
More recent data confirms that the French are still breaking all the rules. The French still eat more saturated fat than people in the United Kingdom, but have about 1/3 the number of heart disease deaths.
Well, my explanation is, of course, the consumption of alcohol.
There has been for years the belief by doctors in many countries that alcohol, in particular red wine, reduces the risk of heart disease.
That's true. It's also true in America. Well, people who drink red wine in America tend to be middle class, highly educated, have healthy lifestyles. So it's red wine drinking tends to be associated with a certain lifestyle. So this is really just an association that they found. You can find that moderate alcohol consumption protects against heart disease. You'll find that in Spain, you'll find that in Italy, you'll find it in France, you'll find it in any country. Moderate alcohol consumption is protective. Not red wine particularly. Red wine has no obvious advantages over anything else.
France is not the only place we find a paradox. People in Iceland also consume more saturated fat than people in the United Kingdom, but Iceland only has about half the heart disease death rate. In Denmark, people eat less saturated fat than people in Iceland, but the Danes have a higher rate of heart disease deaths. The Portuguese have about 1/3 less saturated fat in their diet than the French, but a higher rate of heart disease deaths. People in Lithuania consume only half as much saturated fat as people in the United Kingdom, but Lithuania has almost double the rate of heart disease deaths. Some authorities say that our saturated fat intake should be below 7% of total calories. Lithuania is almost on target in this respect, but Lithuania has one of the highest heart disease death rates in the world.
Several very recent studies have conclusively demonstrated a lack of any relationship between saturated fat consumption and heart disease.
And questioning the dangers posed by an established threat, saturated fats. A meta-analysis of 72 studies found no convincing evidence that a diet rich in these animal-based fats increased the risk of heart disease. Bruce Griffin is Professor of Nutritional Metabolism at the University of Surrey, and Professor Jeremy Pearson is Medical Director of the British Heart Foundation, who part-funded the research. How convinced are we that there is a direct correlation between saturated fat intake and heart disease? What evidence is out there to convince us of that?
There is enormous amount of evidence. We're pretty confident that there's a strong relationship between saturated fat and blood cholesterol.
Just remind us how convinced you are that raised cholesterol levels lead to increased risk of heart disease and stroke.
OK, that's incontrovertible as well, I think, in the sense that not only is the association absolutely barred or obvious that if you raise cholesterol, you raise the risk of heart disease. That's all over the world, any population. But also we know that any intervention that lowers cholesterol lowers risk, so the two are directly related and causal.
All three people taking part in this radio programme, including the presenter, already firmly believed that saturated fat and cholesterol cause heart disease, and no one with the opposite point of view was invited to take part. This particular episode of Inside Health seemed to be just an attempt to explain away an awkward scientific finding that challenged the belief system held by medical opinion leaders. As we've heard, the current belief system suggests any intervention that lowers cholesterol also lowers the risk of heart disease.
When people talk about trying to end heart attacks in the world, or in America at least, one of the ways to do that is to take a look inside the heart, see what's happening before someone ever has a problem. And that's what we're going to do here today. You're actually going to look for what in my heart?
Yes, for calcium, which is part of the atherosclerotic process, the plaques in the heart.
Studies have consistently shown that cholesterol-lowering statins actually increase the amount of calcified plaque in the arteries. Ironic for a drug that's supposed to prevent heart disease. The Veterans Affairs Diabetes Trial found that more frequent statin use was associated with accelerated coronary artery calcification. Another study published in the journal Atherosclerosis found that statins also increase the amount of calcified plaque in healthy people without diabetes. And yet another study published in the Journal of the American College of Cardiology found similar results. These studies have been quietly ignored by the medical establishment and the mainstream media. However, these important findings were highlighted in a review article written by Professor Sharif Sultan and Dr. Neve Hines in 2013. Professor Sultan is a world-leading vascular and endovascular surgeon. He's Chief of Vascular and Endovascular Surgery at the Galway Clinic in Ireland and Chairman of the Western Vascular Institute. Professor Sultan has over 25 years of vascular experience and gained his qualifications in Egypt, Dublin, Paris, Romania, Switzerland, the United States, and London. His research portfolio has been recognized by 29 international awards, and he's one of the pioneers of minimally invasive endovascular techniques.
Now, the idea is cholesterol causing heart disease is unproven. Cholesterol is crucial for energy, for thyroid function, for sex hormone function, for normal ability of the brain to perform, for all your function in the body to do well. If your cholesterol goes up, that means it's a compensatory mechanism. You cannot drug it with statin.
Professor Sultan told us about numerous case studies where his patients have experienced dramatic improvements in their health by stopping their statin medication.
A nun who runs a big convent, and she suddenly starting forgetting where's the checks, the combination of the safe. She knows everybody by the name. She starts forgetting who's coming and who's going out. She used to control everything, have the keys, have everything. She was working like a Swiss clock. They saw that she has a carotid artery disease, so they sent it to me. CT scan, MRIs, duplex, you name it. Couldn't find anything at all. And again, we start talking to her. And she said, yes, 6 months ago, the GP gave me that medication to lower my cholesterol, who was 5.8. The woman initiative study, done over 150,000 women, shows no evidence in primary prevention with statin for women. She stopped it, she's back running, and every Christmas I have a fantastic card from her thanking me. I didn't do anything, in fact, I've just stopped a tablet. And her life is giving back to her on a golden plate.
We asked Professor Sultan about the reaction to his review article that was heavily critical of the widespread use of statins.
Okay, you know the phrase red, retired and even dangerous. A lot of them like that. They have coalesced in a corner and they don't want to change their mind. However, the young generation well accepted, and they congratulate me on that because the social media have exposed everything. Some of my colleagues supported me like crazy, but some of them tried to discredit the publication. However, they couldn't come back with one single publication that could support their claim, and that's why we call them red.
Professor Jeremy Pearson of the British Heart Foundation states that the relationship between cholesterol and heart disease is consistent all over the world in any population. Of course, the British Heart Foundation is not the only organisation that holds this belief.
Now, to explore the link between saturated fat and heart disease further, the National Heart Foundation Chief Executive, Dr. Lynn Roberts, joins us from Melbourne. Dr. Roberts, thanks very much for taking the time out. Now, a number of cardiologists are adding voices to the call to bust the so-called myth of the role of saturated fat in heart disease. Are you still confident that saturated fat is still the #1 culprit?
We at the Heart Foundation strongly believe that there's very good evidence from right around the world that shows that saturated fat plays a role in raising blood cholesterol, and of course high blood cholesterol is a risk factor for heart disease.
If we look at the populations already mentioned, we can see that there is not a great deal of difference between the average cholesterol levels for each country, yet the number of heart disease deaths varies greatly. For example, Lithuania and Portugal have roughly the same average cholesterol levels, but Lithuania has more than 4 times the number of heart disease deaths. We might wonder how Professor Jeremy Pearson and other experts could have missed this data challenging the cholesterol hypothesis, especially considering that the data is actually published by the British Heart Foundation themselves. In fact, rather than being consistent all over the world, it's actually difficult to find any country that fits with the saturated fat or cholesterol hypothesis. In Greece, we find another so-called paradox. The island of Crete is steeped in history, being home to the oldest city in Europe and the ancient Minoan civilization. Crete is a popular destination for European holidaymakers during the summer months, but away from the coast, up here in the mountains, there's a village that has been of interest to researchers. The village is called Anogia, and researchers have taken an interest in it because despite eating a high-fat diet, the residents of the village have an extremely low rate of heart disease. Researchers from the Wellcome Trust Sanger Institute in Cambridge, United Kingdom, proposed that the villagers are protected from their diet by a rare genetic mutation. Considering the history of Anugia and its people, a genetic link may seem plausible, since the people are known for their strong character and resilience. Anugia has always been heavily involved in the resistance against foreign invaders to the island. As a result, the village was burned down twice by the Turks and then again by the Nazis. After each demolition, the village was rebuilt. The strength and resilience of the people of Anugia is not in question. However, the genetic study was inconclusive. The researchers did find the rare genetic mutation to be much more common in Anugia. However, it was still only present in about 2% of the population. So Anugia remains yet another so-called paradox. Another place that has been of interest to researchers is the island of Sardinia. Sardinia has an unusually high number of people who live to be more than 100 years old. Scientists have highlighted the Barbagia region in particular as being associated with a very long lifespan. The traditional diet of the Barbagia region is known to consist of meat and cheese. Suckling pig is a particular favorite. In 2011, Sardinians called for formal recognition of their diet, insisting that the secret to a long life can be found in their traditional diet of lamb, roast piglet, milk, and cheese. The contradictions to the cholesterol hypothesis are not confined to Europe. Japan is another country associated with a low rate of heart disease. For example, the heart disease mortality rate in Japan is about 1/3 to 1/5 of that in the United States. It's often assumed that the Japanese consume a low-fat diet and have low cholesterol levels.
They have increased their saturated fat intake by 200%, and over the last 50 years, their cholesterol level has gone up by about 25 to 30% on average, and their heart disease rate has gone down by 70%. Possibly more extraordinary is that their rate of stroke has gone down by 700%.
Within Japan, some places have an even lower rate of heart disease deaths than the rest of the country. Recent studies have highlighted Fukuoka Prefecture as having a low rate of heart disease deaths even by Japanese standards. Fukuoka is famous for Hakata ramen, a noodle soup covered with thickly sliced fatty pork. Other popular dishes include motsunabe, a kind of hot pot made using beef or pork offal, and yakitori. In general, the food in Fukuoka tends to be fatty and salty, challenging not only the cholesterol hypothesis, but also the idea that dietary salt causes heart disease. Tomohito Hamazaki is Professor Emeritus at the University of Toyama.
More than 15 years ago, I was a guy who believed in cholesterol theory. I was a very strong cholesterol believer. And every time I found a patient with very high cholesterol levels, I persuaded him or her to take statins. I was wrong, but I believed in that theory. Cholesterol is nothing. We Japanese have very high cholesterol levels and still enjoying low rates of coronary heart disease death.
One of the issues that prompted Professor Hamazaki to look again at the cholesterol theory was the link between lower cholesterol levels and increased mortality. In essence, where cholesterol levels are concerned, many studies have shown the higher, the better.
This is the meta-analysis of Japanese 5 reports showing the relationship between cholesterol levels and all-cause mortality. In men, it's just this trend, and in women, there's nothing here, but if your cholesterol levels are very, very low, then your chance to die is bigger than the other groups. Liver cancer and cirrhosis mortality. So if your cholesterol levels are very low, your chance to die from these diseases here, and this is control, so it decreases like this. And look at this, there is no mortality from cirrhosis. Here again, it's liver cancer incidence. So it's just the higher the better, no victims here. Then in women, it's something like this. Let's look at Korean data. This is very good. Over 1 million Korean adults were followed for 14 years. And the y-axis is showing liver cancer incidence. The same here, the same trend here.
Experts who support the idea that lower cholesterol is better are aware of the connection between low cholesterol levels and a shorter lifespan. However, their theory is that it is the disease that causes low cholesterol rather than low cholesterol causing disease, a concept known as reverse causality.
Okay, it happens to a certain degree. Yes, it happens. There's an epidemiological study following people for, let's say, 10 years. And if that kind of reverse causality happens, then let's delete or exclude deaths that happened during the first 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 years. Then people suffering from serious disease may die away. So just take the latter half of data, then check everything. But usually we still find the relationship between cholesterol and all-cause mortality, and it's the higher the better. That means the reverse causality does not exist to a very significant degree.
The current model of heart disease focuses on several risk factors, often referred to as traditional risk factors, such as high cholesterol, high blood pressure, smoking, diabetes, family history of heart disease, obesity, and age. In 2011, a study published in the Journal of the American Medical Association came up with a surprising result in relation to these risk factors. The researchers looked at 5 of the traditional risk factors in relation to survival after a first heart attack. We might expect to find that those people who didn't survive a first heart attack had more of the traditional risk factors. However, the reverse was true. The more risk factors the person had, the more likely they were to survive a first heart attack. This association between a higher number of risk factors and survival persisted even after adjusting for age and for other clinical factors.
So all these factors correlated with heart disease. If they have those factors high, they're protected. They will live longer. So this is something to me that people should be studying. I mean, it's like, what is wrong? If we've got a model that in these situations is backwards.
That's a complicated issue for several reasons. And they're not dissimilar to what has happened with the cholesterol story.
Some of them do work. Age is probably the most important risk factor, but you can't do anything about that. Being male does carry a greater risk than being female. Smoking is a risk factor. You know, having diabetes. So some of these are definitely, you know, they're correct. But the ones that most people probably hear about, your cholesterol level, your blood pressure, they don't fit.
What is considered to be normal cholesterol has progressively gone down. So you can sell more drugs. The exact same thing is true for hypertension. 120/80 used to be considered normal. Now it's pre-hypertension. So the first thing you have to ask yourself is, well, when you talk about hypertension, what are you talking about? What do you consider normal?
We know there are many papers showing positive association between blood pressure and coronary heart disease. So then people interpret that the hypertension is a risk factor. The hypertension could be the consequence of the progress of atherosclerosis. By raising blood pressure, our body are keeping to supply nutrient and oxygen to the peripheral tissue.
Blood pressure is kind of like cholesterol. Is very often it's not the problem itself, it's the body's response to the problem. And the purpose of a raised blood pressure is to supply more blood to areas that might need it. If you lower blood pressure, you will lower your risk for stroke. But you will not prospectively lower your chances of getting a heart attack or developing atherosclerosis.
I think there's almost no chance to increase life expectancy by using blood pressure lowering drugs.
Well, everyone thinks that obesity is about how much fat you carry. And at least from a definition standpoint, that makes sense because we define obesity on the basis of this thing called BMI, body mass index, which is how much do you weigh versus how tall you are. So in that sense, they're right. The question is that definition even appropriate? When you stand on the scale, what are you measuring? Well, you're measuring 4 compartments at once. You're measuring bone, you're measuring muscle, you're measuring subcutaneous or big butt fat, and then finally the visceral fat, the belly fat. Well, it turns out that visceral fat is only 4 to 6% of your total body weight. So when you stand on the scale, what are you measuring? You don't know. You can't know. So the concept of using BMI as a method for determining obesity and risk for disease makes perfect sense in populations where everything regresses to the mean. But for individuals, BMI is, for lack of a better word, it's garbage.
The biggest change in my lifetime looking after people is that when I came into medicine, the patient came to us with a complaint or a problem, and we tried to sort it out. In the 1960s, 70s, 80s, gradually the whole game changed that in such a way that we were trying to treat people to stop them getting problems, to stop them getting their heart attacks and their strokes in particular. So you've got the matter of treating risk.
If you've heard it once from your doctor, you've probably heard it 1,000 times. Know your numbers, blood pressure, your BMI, and how about your bad cholesterol level?
Okay, but if you're treating risk, there are certain things you need to know. What is the risk? What is the benefit of treatment? And who benefits from that treatment?
Okay, prediction is like stock market. You're going to get an actuarial finance guy who'll sit and predict here what's going to happen in the stock market. That pooled estimate of actuarial futuring in patient doesn't apply. The reason for that, human beings aren't numbers.
Despite the problems with the current risk factor-based approach, it is this model that is used by doctors all over the world as the primary tool to decide who should be medicated.
In an important medical story for Americans tonight, heart doctors are putting out controversial new guidelines for preventing heart disease.
So rather than adjusting the statin dose to reach a certain cholesterol level, the panel now advises doctors to prescribe either a moderate or high dose depending upon the patient's risk factors for cardiovascular disease.
Statins are already taken by millions of people. Their use has quadrupled in the past decade, with 60 million prescriptions a year in England now. GPs currently offer statins to patients who have a 20% risk of a heart attack or stroke in the next 10 years. NICE wants to lower the threshold to 10%, so many more people will end up taking statins.
So is that a form of prevention?
Yeah, that's quite correct, Matt. What's worked out through these calculators, which we've been using in Australia now for a number of years, is adding up all those risk factors, as was mentioned in the previous report, to determine what is your risk of having a heart attack or a stroke in the next 5 years.
We have an update tonight on last week's story about the new guidelines for cholesterol and who should take statins to reduce the risk of heart disease. The guidelines were put out by the American Heart Association and the American College of Cardiology, but tonight there are questions about the formula or the calculator that they used.
Paul Ritger and Nancy Cook of Brigham and Women's Hospital looked at published studies of patients with cardiovascular disease and say the new calculator significantly overestimates the risk. The calculator may suggest statin treatment for about twice as many middle-aged Americans as actually may significantly benefit from it.
One of the recent articles showed that 12 out of the 15 panel group are affiliated with the industry.
The drug industry buys influential doctors, and these doctors are allowed to sit in guideline committees, although most countries have laws of public administration that says otherwise. We also accept it in my country, so I have complained to the Danish ombudsman about this, that our National Board of Health is not living up to our law of public administration because they use these conflicted doctors, and the guidelines get influenced by having conflicted doctors sitting there. And then you have a big problem in general practice because they are supposed to follow these guidelines.
The guideline of Atherosclerosis Society in Japan, published in 2012. Okay. At first, I looked for information of COI. I was very much disappointed. They didn't write it at all. Okay, next year. This is a sister book of this one, okay? And this is also published from JAS, and it says treatment guide for dyslipidemia. Okay, I tried to find COI information again. Yes, I found it. The very first page, yeah, they wrote COI information here. Okay, this one is just for the rules of disclosing COI. And this part is just a list of Japanese pharmaceutical companies and medical equipment companies and publishers. Where are authors of this guideline? Nobody's here. Just a list of companies. Is this COI information? I don't think so. So we do not understand which researcher is getting fund of money or something from which company. No, nothing at all. Just a list of companies. And it says COI. Well, you can laugh at this. But to be honest, I'm not sure to laugh at it or to cry.
Studies have shown that if you ask a doctor to estimate how much benefit they're giving a patient by giving them a certain treatment for blood pressure or cholesterol or blood glucose, they will overestimate. If you actually look at the real figures in terms of the number of people whose lives would be affected by this treatment, you come up with answers where many people in the street would say, well, okay, fair enough, but forget it. I'm not interested in that level of risk.
I'm 61. I've got a predicted risk of having a heart attack over the next 10 years of about 10%, which puts me in the frame now for potentially needing to take or being offered a statin. So at that sort of level, a 10% risk over 10 years, 2 people are going to benefit out of 100, 98 will not get any benefit. So in terms of the amount of treatment you have to mete out to a population for the return that you get in terms of events avoided, is small, but it's almost certainly not a fluke, not due to chance, it's a real effect.
It is not the cholesterol lowering effect, because the statin drugs have many other effects. For instance, they inhibit the coagulation system. No trial has ever shown an association between the degree of cholesterol lowering and the effect on the treatment. I mean, if high cholesterol was the real cause, then those people whose cholesterol went down very much should have more benefit than those whose cholesterol was unchanged. But this is not the case. The effect is the same whether they have normal or very high cholesterol.
The 2% of people who will benefit specifically refers to benefits associated with cardiovascular disease. However, none of the clinical trials done on statins have shown any benefit in terms of deaths from all causes. In other words, people do not live any longer when they take a statin as a preventative measure. This indicates that the unknown adverse effects of the statin are counteracting the small cardiovascular benefit. Although the individual clinical trials have included thousands of people, there has been a suggestion that larger data sets are required in order to demonstrate an increase in life expectancy.
One of the difficulties is that when you do primary prevention trials, not many people die, okay? Which means that you need big numbers to detect small effects. Any individual trial is bound by what is a reasonable amount of money, time, energy, patience to conduct. And that is the virtue of systematic reviews, where you put lots of trials together.
Almost all of the systematic reviews of statins have also failed to show any increase in life expectancy when the medication is given to people who do not have heart disease. In 2011, Professor Ebrahim and colleagues published a Cochrane review of statins, which was one of these systematic reviews. Cochrane is one of the most respected research organizations in the world. The organization itself is free from commercial sponsorship. After completing the Cochrane review, Professor Ebrahim stated, "If you look at the hard endpoints of all deaths and coronary deaths, the effects are consistent with both benefit and with the play of chance. The absolute benefits are really rather small. 1,000 people have to be treated for 1 year to prevent 1 death. It means a lot of people have to be treated to gain this small benefit. As we don't know the harms, it seems wrong-minded to me to treat everyone with a statin." Then, in 2013, the Cochrane review was updated. And this time, the authors were in favor of the widespread use of statins, concluding reductions in all-cause mortality, major vascular events, and revascularizations were found with no excess of adverse events. The authors also said that the widespread use of statins is likely to be cost-effective. So, why the change of heart?
I think you're misreading the earlier version. There was no doubt that statins had beneficial effects. The concerns we had was that at that time, the reporting of the adverse unintended consequences of statins was poor, which made it difficult in the primary prevention setting to be fulsome support for their use. And we said they should be used with some caution. If you're looking at the overall total mortality, and that's what life expectancy is giving you, a translated estimate of total mortality, you're seeing a small, but, and again, probably real effect, but a small effect because of the many other causes that are involved. If you look at it in terms of death rates, all-cause mortality rates, there's been some confusion about this in the literature recently. My reading of the trials is that people on statins, the all-cause mortality rates are lower in people on statins.
And the best estimate that we have, again, what are the actual numbers? What was the absolute risk reduction in all-cause mortality? Or how much longer can someone expect to live in primary prevention by taking a statin?
Well, the data weren't presented in that sort of way. We see actually a small reduction in all-cause mortality on statins, which is consistent with the reduction in the coronary heart disease events that have been reduced.
So if statins in primary prevention do increase life expectancy, where does that evidence come from?
Well, we can't get strong estimates of life expectancy with the trials because they're short. So we can extrapolate from those. But essentially we've got trials that run for 5, 7, 10 years. We've got long-term follow-ups on some of the trials. And the benefits of the statins seem to be prolonged.
But what report, what trial, where is the actual evidence? Because you said that they do increase life expectancy. So what reference, what report can someone look at to?
I think the best summary estimates still come from the cholesterol treatment trialists collaboration report, the 2012 Lancet report.
Now they did a review in 2012 which apparently turned everything on its head and said that yes, statins were beneficial in primary prevention and at very low levels of risk. At that point, all the other groups in the world, even the Cochrane collaboration who said primary prevention is pointless, the benefits are minute. Then the CTT came out, where the Cochrane collaboration changed their minds completely, 180-degree shift. Now, I have concerns about the CTT research because, firstly, they won't show their data to anyone.
Well, we have indeed seen a small effect on people who already have had a heart attack. But I am a little skeptical to the results because it is not possible to get access to the primary data.
They've signed agreements with pharmaceutical companies that they won't release the data. So we're relying on them alone.
What we now know from experience gained over the last 20 years or so is that it would be a much better place for the industry and for patients and for those of us trying to make sense of the data if all that data were available.
And all these trials have been performed and paid by the drug industry, the same industry that produce the drug they are testing on patients. It's not a good idea.
So we're essentially relying on the pharmaceutical companies to have provided all the data required and for the CTT to have done an analysis on that, upon which rests all of the advice for the use of statins around the world. I don't think that's a good situation to be in, because the cholesterol trialist collaboration is also a part of another unit called the CTSU in Oxford, which is the Clinical Trials Service Unit, which essentially runs multi-million pound studies on behalf of the pharmaceutical industry. So I think there are dangers here of significant conflicts of interest, which have not really been addressed, and I think they ought to be.
95% of research done on statin is funded by the multinational. And that's the problem. A big multinational comes in, spend a couple of billions on a trial, and then tell you that it's good. Nobody trusts that anymore. We've been burned few times to the extent that whatever result any multinational is going to get, we do not trust.
It is a very bizarre situation because if I was accused of something in a court case and I came up in court with 15 meters of documents and told the judge, this is all the evidence there is in my case, I have collected it myself, please tell me if I'm guilty or not, I might be thrown out of court. But this is the system we have created for the drug industry. And we must think about the fact that the difference between an honest data analysis and a not so honest data analysis can actually be worth billions of dollars or euros on the world market.
Remember, the stock market depends on a lot of this multinational. However, my patients are the most important. I don't care about the stock market. I care about my patient.
The influence of the pharmaceutical companies is everywhere. They have their tentacles everywhere. And they try to, I'm sorry for this expression, but that's true, they try to bribe every type of person they can. And there are examples that they have bribed every type of person there is, including ministers of health. So the money is everywhere. The drug industry systematically buys doctors. They buy their loyalty by putting thousands of them on their advisory boards or as consultants, or they lecture for drug companies. which is also bad because education of doctors should have nothing to do with drug companies. And in this way, they buy loyalty among doctors. So doctors won't protest too much if they are told that they cannot get access to the data they collected themselves in clinical trials and check whether the data analysis performed by the drug companies are okay. There are many, many ways you can look at the same data set, and there are also always uncertainties and ambiguities, and you need to make up your mind. Was this a heart attack or wasn't it a heart attack, and so on. And then you can analyze the data in lots of different ways when you have decided who had an event and who didn't have an event. So it is really possible to massage your data until they tell you what you want to hear. And I have seen that many times over my career, where things that were published in the major journals in this world were simply untrustworthy when we, in rare cases, got access to the data through lawsuits or through drug agencies.
After the first Cochrane review, the authors highlighted these issues concerning the commercial sponsorship of clinical trials, and in a press release stated that all but one of the trials they reviewed were industry-sponsored. The lead researcher, Dr. Fiona Taylor, stated, "We know that industry-sponsored trials are more likely to report favorable results for drugs versus placebos, so we have to be cautious about interpreting these results." However, these concerns seem to have disappeared after the second review, which used even more pharmaceutical company-sponsored data than the first review. We asked Professor Ibrahim if he's concerned about problems associated with the commercial interests.
It's an inevitability that trials are commissioned by pharmaceutical industries, occasionally in partnership with non-commercial sponsors. And I think if you look at the integrity of the research groups that have been doing the trials, it would be hard to imagine that any industry hand had been involved in those analyses. They're not the sort of analyses that come out of anything other than a very skilled academic group of researchers. The Oxford group have invested a lot of time, a lot of money's been spent on setting up that individual patient database with a very large number of randomized trials included in it, industry-sponsored. And I think they've done an incredibly good job of the analysis of that data.
The Clinical Trial Service Unit is run by Professor Sir Rory Collins. Professor Collins has been heavily critical of anyone who questions the benefits of statins. He's also tried to use his influence to have scientific papers that are critical of his research removed from the British Medical Journal. We requested an interview with Professor Collins to discuss the evidence for the widespread use of statins. Initially, Professor Collins agreed to this, then 2 days later declined our invitation. Pharmaceutical companies are not the only sponsors of the Clinical Trial Service Unit. The British Heart Foundation also gives them money. We wanted to ask the British Heart Foundation about their support for the CTSU and the clinical evidence for the widespread use of statins. After a brief exchange of emails, they also declined our invitation to take part.
There is not one single trial that have proven that statin works in primary prevention.
We are all going to die. And if we don't have some certainty that by taking a drug for decades, we will expect to live longer, and when we don't know really what the harms are, because they are always badly reported, then we have a problem.
This kind of guidelines of the big pharma, by the big pharma, and for the big pharma. It's crazy.
Heart disease has historically been thought of as a disease of affluence, the basic idea being that wealthier people can afford to be lazy and eat an unhealthy diet. However, the World Health Organization estimates that more than 80% of all cardiovascular disease deaths occur in low and middle income countries. Heart disease is also often thought of as a modern disease, being associated with contemporary food choices and lifestyles. Although there are established links with certain lifestyle factors, heart disease is certainly not something new. In 1911, a great pioneer of paleopathology, Sir Mark Armand Ruffer, described the presence of arterial plaques in Egyptian mummies. Many years later, researchers became intrigued by a sign displayed inside the Cairo Museum stating that ancient Egyptians suffered from heart disease just like present-day humans. To investigate this further, researchers formed the Horus study. This involved a multidisciplinary team of cardiologists, Egyptologists, radiologists, and molecular biologists. During the first stage of the study, using CT scans, the researchers confirmed the presence of atherosclerosis in ancient Egyptian mummies. Then the researchers extended the study to include mummies from 3 other regions of the world, spanning 4,000 years of human history. Evidence of atherosclerosis was found in individuals from all populations studied. Our ancient ancestors, of course, didn't smoke cigarettes, didn't have fast food, and were probably more physically active than we are today, yet they were still susceptible to the buildup of plaque within arteries. Unfortunately, we have no idea how common heart disease was at that time, or if the arterial plaques correlated with any specific lifestyle factors. However, these findings do tell us that heart disease is not exclusively caused by the standard Western diet, and that the processes associated with heart disease have been part of the human condition for a very long time. So how can we untangle the many paradoxes into a more coherent understanding of the causes of heart disease? There's a natural inclination to look at the healthiest populations and try to emulate the aspects of their nutrition and lifestyles that seem to promote longevity. However, this is only half the story. In order to gather as many clues as possible, we should also look at those populations who suffer from the most ill health. Where heart disease is concerned, one of the most striking and consistent findings can be seen in the hierarchy of societies.
People with a low income have a much higher risk of dying of heart disease. For example, in England, men in the lowest socioeconomic group are almost 3 times more likely to die of heart disease than men in the highest socioeconomic group. We might expect, therefore, that there are more people with high cholesterol in the lowest socioeconomic group. However, the reverse is true. The lowest socioeconomic group have fewer people with high cholesterol. Women in England, in the lowest socioeconomic group, are 5 times more likely to die of heart disease than women in the highest socioeconomic group, but have approximately the same number of people with high cholesterol.
Although cholesterol levels are not higher in the socioeconomic groups that suffer the most heart disease, other factors sometimes are. In the UK, the lower socioeconomic groups tend to have more people who smoke, more central obesity, and more diabetes. So could the increased risk associated with a lower status in society be explained by some of these traditional risk factors? This is what researchers from the University of California wanted to know. Their investigation concluded that changes in the traditional risk factors could not account for the increased risk, and a lower socioeconomic status is somehow an independent risk factor in itself. In Australia, we also find a clear correlation between a lower socioeconomic status and an increased risk of heart disease. Here, people in the lowest socioeconomic group have twice as many heart disease deaths as those in the highest socioeconomic group. Although the same trend is seen as in England, the heart health inequality is much less pronounced in Australia than it is in England. It's a complicated picture, but the difference might be explained by the fact that Australia has considerably more social mobility. In a study that included 34 developed countries, Australia was one of the best in terms of prospects for social mobility, and Great Britain was among the worst.
There's a Michael Marmot to was in charge of running the Whitehall study, which is a very long-term study going on in civil servants in London, and has demonstrated very clearly that your position in the social hierarchy of that organisation, so the top people, top professionals, and then you go down to more junior clerking staff, but as you move up the social ladder, your risk of heart disease falls down.
The Whitehall study is a famous study that demonstrated that the amount of stress that people were under predicted their demise and their susceptibility to these chronic metabolic diseases.
So position in social hierarchy is very important.
Many of the countries having the most heart disease deaths also tend to have high levels of societal stress. We've already seen that Lithuania has one of the highest rates of heart disease deaths in the world, despite having very low saturated fat consumption. Vilnius, the capital of Lithuania, is a popular tourist destination. The medieval old town is a UNESCO World Heritage Site and architecturally one of the most interesting cities in Europe. Vilnius is also of great historical significance for the Catholic religion. However, away from the historical old town, the challenges that Lithuania has faced in the past are also visible. Although the economy is now improving, Lithuania has experienced many societal and economic challenges caused by several changes in governance over a relatively short period of time. Lithuania has been under the control of the Polish, Nazi Germany, and the former Soviet Union, gaining independence in 1991 after large demonstrations across the country. And today, Lithuania is a member of the European Union.
After the breakdown of the Soviet Union, people's pensions disintegrated, they lost jobs. Although communism and the communist state was not seen as a utopia, compared to what happened afterwards, there was just utter breakdown. People despaired. They lost everything. The huge stresses on them at that time. And there are mechanisms that you can look at as to why that ends up causing heart disease. Western medicine, if you want to call it that, or reductionist medicine, has kind of said, well, there's the mind and the body. The two aren't connected in any way, and they've dismissed stress as a possible cause of heart disease. However, I started looking at this many years ago, and I said, well, how can it? What is going on? One of the first signs of damage is that the system becomes inflexible. So, for instance, when children are being born, there's a heart rate monitor goes on to the mother's tummy, and it measures the fetal heart rate. Now, the most dangerous sign is when the heart rate stops going up and down, is when it flattens. When it flattens, that child's in trouble and it needs to get out, and that's when they do emergency cesarean section. Something's going horribly wrong. And you can actually measure heart rate variability. It requires a bit more sensitive machinery because the difference is smaller to the naked eye, but you can see the heart rate, when it's variable, when it's hunting, when it's going up and down, is a sign of a healthy heart. And in fact, once you lose heart rate variability, your risk of premature mortality is enormously raised. I mean, by far more than any other risk factor I've ever seen. A study in Finland demonstrated that after 10 years, this is in elderly people when they start 65 years old, 10 years later, if you had good heart rate variability, your chances of being alive were 80. 10 years later was 80%. If you had poor heart rate variability, your chances of being alive 10 years later was 20%. That is a 60% absolute difference in mortality. You will not find any other variable that will give you anything within a 10-fold factor of that. It's just a huge difference.
Low heart rate variability is a bad indicator of heart disease risk, and the heart rate, I think the heart rate becomes very little variability because the system can't handle that kind of dramatic change.
In diabetes, it's considered you develop frank diabetes when your insulin production is just burnt out, inflexible and gone. So you're producing quite a lot of insulin, but it's failing to respond. So again, systems, if you can measure systems that lose flexibility, you're measuring an unhealthy system.
Cortisol is our stress hormone. Cortisol helps our cells adapt to various stressors. In the old days, stressors were physical stressors like running away from lions and injury and what have you. And what cortisol did was it held on to salt, and it also created more sugar so that cells had more energy available to them, particularly in times of starvation. So cortisol is our stress hormone, and we need cortisol. But we also need cortisol to go back down once the stress is over. The problem is we are now all under chronic stress. Our maladaptive society has now created chronic stress. And that chronic stress also raises cortisol, but it never goes down.
And what happens to people is if that becomes burnt out, it becomes flat. So you get this kind of very flattened picture. So once that system starts to go wrong, once that system begins to become flattened and damaged, you can see a whole spectrum of abnormalities coming out of that. You can become insulin resistant, you can become diabetic, you can become centrally obese, you can develop high VLDL levels, your blood pressure goes up.
Cortisol helps deposit the energy into visceral, belly fat, as opposed to subcutaneous or butt fat, if you will. And that belly fat is much more dangerous in terms of that insulin resistance and driving that chronic metabolic disease. And cortisol is a specific instigator of that phenomenon.
It's done by a researcher called Bjorn Torp, who did a lot of this work and showed loss of flexibility of cortisol secretion was a really major important sign of developing heart disease, cancer, in fact almost all diseases. We see people who are chronically stressed, people with fibromyalgia have high or abnormal or flattened cortisol secretion. They also die of heart disease and cancer. If you give people cortisol artificially, as in steroids, they develop the entire same spectrum of symptoms and they die of heart disease.
The fact is we have numerous pieces of data that show us that glucocorticoids or cortisol, drive these chronic metabolic diseases.
In the body, cortisol is secreted via the hypothalamic pituitary adrenal axis, or HPA axis. In essence, when the brain perceives stress or a threat, it sends a signal to the adrenal glands, which in turn produce more cortisol. The effect that cortisol has on metabolic function and the activation of the HPA axis causes a cascade of physiological changes that can increase the risk of heart disease.
So if you look at people, for instance, who've suffered post-traumatic stress disorder and you measure what's going on in their brains, their hypothalamic, their HPA axis is shot to hell. It doesn't work anymore. They don't respond the same as you or I would to stress. Sometimes something that wouldn't bother us, the whole system lights up. Other times it shuts down. They've got a flattened system. And these people are far more likely to die of heart disease at a young age. So I'm not sure which of these metabolic problems is the key one, but one of the possibly the most important one is your increase in your clotting in your blood. Your blood becomes much more ready to clot, which makes sense. If cortisol's a stress hormone, when you're stressed, you're in a fight or flight response. When you're in a fight, you don't want to bleed profusely if you're injured, so your coagulation system is fired up. And we know that the underlying cause of heart disease, well, the final terminal event in heart disease and a stroke is the development of a blood clot, a thrombus, which blocks an artery and causes a heart attack. Now some people believe, and I also believe, that you have these events going on, non-terminal events, clotting going on in your arteries quite a lot, where that's when the artery first narrows and then another one goes on top and on top and on top. So repeated coagulation is a very dangerous position to be in. We can see that people who become dehydrated become more ready for their blood to clot, and this is when heart attacks very often happen. So we have potentially this is the underlying mechanism, I think, that's of significance.
Of course, stress can also be positive and beneficial. Many people thrive in a stimulating and challenging environment, and many of the fun things in life could technically be called stressful. However, chronic negative stress, often associated with a lack of control over life's events, has far-reaching health consequences. In addition, stress is very much an individual thing. It depends on what we as individuals find stressful. In the 1996 Football European Championships, there was a very close-fought match played between France and the Netherlands. The match went to penalty kicks, and France won. On the day of the match, there was a statistically significant increase in heart attacks and strokes in men in the Netherlands, but not in women. The wrong kind of stress can also accelerate the aging process. and shorten our telomeres, which are the caps protecting our DNA. There's also a strong association between shorter telomeres and a significantly increased risk of heart disease. And more recent studies have shown that a poor socioeconomic environment can shorten telomere length. We don't yet know if the shorter telomeres actually cause heart disease directly or if they're part of the overall condition. However, these findings further support a coherent argument for stress and psychological factors being a major cause of heart disease.
Stress is like cyanide for your body. The more you get stressed, the more you're killing yourself. Accumulation of stress, like accumulation of toxins inside your body, it will end you with diabetes mellitus, with heart attack and cancer. And there's a lot of ways to avoid stress. Most importantly is to change your life. If you don't like your job, but it's paying the bills, change your life. Do not stay still. You cannot fly except when you spread your wings. Whether a job, whether a partner, a car, whether anything, you have to change it. You have to relieve that stress by any means.
The many physiological effects that chronic stress has on the body can also compromise the immune system, which leads to another potential cause of heart disease.
If you are chronically stressed, you are at a much higher risk of being infected. What all agree about is that the start, it is a small bubble localized on the inside of the arterial wall, and when this bubble rupture, its content goes out into the artery, and it starts the coagulation process, and it may end up with a total blockage of the artery. Nobody has ever been able to explain how does this bubble, we call it the vulnerable plaque, how does it start? Why is it created in the arteries? Nobody has been able to explain it, but what we have explained, Kilmer, Macaulay and I, is the mechanism. We think that the detrimental event is that these capillaries on the outside of the arteries, they are blocked by something. They could be blocked by stress, they could be blocked by a substance called homocysteine. But what we think is a real cause is clumps of bacteria and viruses and lipoproteins. Because what very few people know, even researchers inside this area, is that the lipoproteins, LDL, for instance, they participate in the immune system by attaching to all kinds of bacteria and virus and inactivate them. And it's a very effective system. It takes seconds, and normally this take place in the wound, in a damaged wound that had been infected. But if the immune system is imperfect, these clumps, bacteria and virus clumps, clumped together by the lipoproteins, may come into the circulation, and they may be so large that they have difficulties passing the small capillaries in the arterial wall. In particular in the arterial wall, because the pressure outside these capillaries is very high in an artery, whereas in a vein it's very low. So we think that here the capillaries may be blocked by these clumps of bacteria and viruses. When they occlude the capillaries in the arterial wall, a small part of the arterial wall will die, and instead it will be filled with bacteria and viruses, and in this way they will cause a small blister in the arterial wall. And when this blister open, then we have a catastrophe. There are many observations that are in accord with our hypothesis. Firstly, the symptoms with acute heart disease, they are very similar to an infectious disease. Most people with heart disease, at least the major heart disease, they got fever, the number of leukocytes, white blood cells in the blood, they go up, sedimentation rate goes up. These are the same symptoms as we see in infectious diseases. In serious heart attacks, you will also find an increased number of bacteria in the blood. Many other factors interact here. For instance, lack of vitamins, lack of vitamin C, lack of vitamin D, increase the risk of infections. The concentration of vitamin C inside the white blood cells is 80 times higher than in the blood, which means that it must have an important function in the white blood cells. Stress is certainly increase the risk of infection. All factors that influence our immune system in a negative way, they may provoke cardiovascular disease.
So, rather than being caused by artery clogging fats and cholesterol, heart disease could more accurately be described as a clotting process. This clotting process involves the potential interaction of stress, the immune system, nutritional imbalances, and environmental factors, each potential cause having more or less importance depending on each individual person's unique set of circumstances. This has huge implications for the system that is currently in place. Most of the real causes of heart disease cannot be assessed by using a simple risk calculator. The use of this calculator serves the purposes of the pharmaceutical industry. And in countries like the UK, it's also used as a performance-related pay scheme for doctors. For some patient groups, doctors are paid more money if they drive their patients' cholesterol levels down. Despite decades of research, there is no actual evidence to show that lower cholesterol levels are healthier. In fact, the more we learn about cholesterol, the more we begin to appreciate its ability to protect us from serious diseases and infections and promote longevity. Experts who support the widespread use of cholesterol-lowering statins routinely tell us that the benefits of these medications far outweigh the risks. They tell us this through statements issued to the media, often through press releases. However, when asked to justify their claims, they are ominously silent. The organizations that we are supposed to be able to trust choose to ignore their own data and instead go along with the current system that is heavily rigged in favor of the drugs companies.
There should be changes all over the place. We need a revolution. It's not enough with reforms because the whole system is so rotten that we need a revolution. And one of the first things is that doctors should look at themselves in the mirror and ask themselves, can I really defend accepting money from a corrupt industry? Which business model is organized crime that has caused the death of hundreds of thousands of patients over the years? Can I really accept to get money from an industry like that? I think the answer is very simple. You must say no.